Quake 3 has some very well-known movement bugs. In fact, I've talked about a couple of these in earlier videos. This time, I want to talk about a slightly less well-known bug, but arguably one of the weirdest, the overbounce bug. In this video, we're going to explain what an overbounce is, explore the Quake 3 source code to see what causes this bug, dig into a few variations, and look at how tooling can help players looking to exploit this trick. The most basic version of the trick is performed by jumping onto a flat surface with no lateral velocity as you fall. This is usually done by jumping against a wall or a corner and then falling vertically onto the floor. To be done reliably, frame rate independent physics must be enabled, and even then the trick will only ever work from a very limited range of heights. When successful, the player bounces off the ground up to the same height that they fell from. To see how this works, let's take a look at the player movement code. In particular, let's look at the pMoveSingle function, which is called to update the player's position and velocity on every physics frame. There's a lot going on here, but most doesn't apply during an overbounce. Let's remove code that relates to power-ups, animation, and movement modes other than being in the air and on the ground. One of the first things pMoveSingle does is scan for a ground plane beneath the player. If the player is more than 0.25 game units, or about half a millimeter above a solid surface, then the player is considered to be in the air. In this case, pml.walking is false and the airMove function gets called. Let's take a look at that. Again, this is a big function, but most of the cases don't apply in this situation. In fact, with no inputs, this function reduces to just the call to pmStepSlideMove, which we'll come on to shortly. Now, let's say we are within 0.25 units of the ground. In this case, the ground trace detects a solid object beneath the player and we fall into the pmWalkMove function. Again, we can ignore most of this function, particularly if we assume no inputs, as is the case during a normal overbounce. We can inline these two reduced functions inside pMoveSingle so all the relevant update logic is visible at once. Let's step through this code, starting from a point where the player is falling towards the ground with zero lateral velocity. To start off with, we'll show a normal landing without the overbounce bug. The first important line is the ground trace call, which, since the player is far above the ground, puts us into the pmStepSlideMove call. This call increases the player's downward velocity according to gravity and integrates velocity to work out how far the player should shift in position. Since the velocity only has a vertical component, this means shifting the player down. If this move results in no collisions, as it does in this case, then nothing else is done. This process repeats until the player is close enough to the ground that the pmStepSlideMove call results in a collision. In this case, the function stops the movement short so that the player is exactly on the ground and clips the velocity to be zero. On subsequent iterations, the ground trace determines that the player is walking, and so we branch into the first case. When the velocity is zero, none of these calls actually do anything, and so the player remains resting on the ground. So what happens with an overbounce? An overbounce occurs when the final in-air step ends up less than a quarter of a unit above the ground, but nevertheless completes its full step without actually colliding with the ground. In this case, the velocity is not clipped to zero, and so the next step falls into the walking code path with a large vertical velocity vector. In this case, the velocity is clipped to the ground plane by pmClipVelocity. The function starts by adding a scalar multiple of the normal vector to the velocity until the resulting vector has a small positive dot product with the normal. That is to say, until it is pointing slightly away from the floor. The amount it goes back on itself is determined by the overbounce variable, which is fixed at a value of 1.001, or to put it another way, the vector is scaled in the vertical axis by a factor of -1000. The subsequent two lines scale this small vector to have the same magnitude from before the clipping, resulting in an upward velocity equal in magnitude but opposite in direction to the previous velocity, causing the player to fly upwards to the point that they originally fell from. To perform an overbounce, we need to somehow manipulate the jump so that while falling, the player ends up less than a quarter of a unit above the ground, before actually hitting the ground. By default, Quake's physics frame times are determined by the rendering frame time, which is random enough to make overbounces very inconsistent. Still though, Overbounces can be performed consistently if fixed physics frame times are enforced by setting the pmoved fixed variable to 1. With this set, vertical motion is entirely deterministic, so ranges of dropped heights that result in an overbounce can be computed, as is done in this short Python snippet. There are different sets of heights depending on whether you simply drop off the initial platform or jump off. Since overbounce heights can be calculated in this way, it's possible to write a mod that displays surfaces that can be overbounced. Here is my mod, where blue indicates platforms on which a drop overbounce can be performed, and yellow indicates platforms on which a jump overbounce can be performed. Some of the surfaces here are striped. To explain what they indicate, we need to talk about sticky overbounces. Here is the walk move function, this time including the code that handles player inputs. Normally when a player is on the ground, they rest exactly on the ground plane. However, since the player is considered to be walking whenever they are 0.25 units from the ground, one can manipulate the position to be within this range. For example, a well-placed plasma gun blast will shift the player to be slightly above the ground. Once in this position, the walk move function restricts any acceleration due to the usual directional inputs to be parallel to this plane, and also gravity is not applied. This means the player remains at this height. This technique is known as a sticky overbounce and can also be performed by dropping off a small step. Sticky overbounces are particularly useful since the additional height opens up a set of new surfaces that can be overbounced from. This is what the striped texture in my mod indicates. What happens if you have some horizontal velocity rather than simply falling straight down? For example, here is the same situation as before, only the player has tapped forward while falling so that there is a small amount of forward speed. Since we have some horizontal speed, friction is applied, which scales the entire velocity vector. Next, the clip velocity call adds to the vertical component until the vector points slightly upwards, as it does with a normal overbounce. The horizontal component remains the same, and so when the vector is scaled to the original length, the result is almost all forwards. This results in what is known as a horizontal overbounce. With a well-timed jump just afterwards, momentum can be maintained. At this point you might ask, what happens if you have less forward speed? If the forward component is reduced, could we end up with a diagonal overbounce? The answer is yes, but in both scenarios it's a bit more involved than simply having a smaller forward component during the fall. In fact, it's by far the hardest of the tricks here to get right. To understand why, let's take a closer look at the walk move function. The function has three parts that influence the velocity. The first is friction, which scales the velocity by some fraction that is related to the current horizontal speed. Next, player inputs are handled, which adds some acceleration parallel to the ground, depending on which keys are pressed. Finally, the velocity is clipped against the ground using the logic discussed earlier. The issue is with the friction function. In short, if the horizontal speed is below a certain threshold, 1.5% of normal running speed, then the friction function reduces the entire velocity vector, including the vertical component, to 0, resulting in a complete stop and no overbounce. This severely limits the bounce angle that can be achieved for reasonable fall heights. The trick is to have a modest forward speed while falling through the air, about 10% of normal running speed, and then press the backwards key on the exact frame that the player hits the ground. This forward speed is high enough that the friction call doesn't completely kill the velocity. The player acceleration code then reduces the horizontal velocity due to the backwards key being pressed. Finally, as before, the clipping call flips and scales the vertical component by a factor of 1,000. Get this just right, and the player flies off in a diagonal direction. This covers all the major ways in which overbounces are performed. Let me know in the comments if there are any other tricks that you'd like me to investigate in the Quake series or in any other game. And remember to like and subscribe.